It was one of those days when everything felt ordinary. The supermarket was busy, the aisles filled with people pushing carts and the soft hum of background music. Two young police officers, Daniel and Chris, were sitting in their patrol car, outside the store, sipping coffee and hoping the shift would stay quiet. The city had been calm that week and both were looking forward to a peaceful afternoon. That calm didn't last long. Their radio suddenly crackled with a voice from dispatch. Unit 12, we've got a call from the local supermarket. Possible shoplifting in progress. Female suspect. Security has her on camera. Daniel looked at Chris and sighed. A shoplifting case. All right, let's check it out. They drove to the store, parked near the entrance, and walked in. The manager, a short man with nervous eyes, hurried toward them. Officers, thank goodness you're here, he said quickly. She's right there near the exit. She's been putting expensive items in her bag without paying. The officers followed his gaze. A woman, maybe in her early 40s, stood near the checkout counters. She was well-dressed with neatly tied hair and calm eyes. She didn't look like someone trying to sneak away with stolen goods. She was holding a reusable grocery bag and seemed to be waiting for someone. Chris leaned closer to Daniel. Doesn't look like a shoplifter to me. Daniel shrugged. Let's just talk to her. They approached her slowly. Ma'am, Daniel said politely. Could you step aside for a moment? The woman turned to them, a little surprised but not frightened. Of course, she said softly. The manager joined them, holding a tablet that displayed some security footage. Here, he said, tapping the screen. You can see her putting items into her bag. She never paid for them. The video showed the woman placing groceries in her bag, but the clip ended abruptly before showing the checkout area. Daniel frowned. Do you have the full footage? The manager hesitated. This is what I was sent from security, but she was heading toward the door, so we stopped her before she left. The woman spoke calmly. I was using the self-checkout machine. It froze in the middle of the transaction. I was going to call someone to help, but your staff stopped me before I could. Chris looked uncertain. Do you have a receipt? She shook her head. Not yet. The machine didn't print one. I even tried to tell the cashier, but no one listened. The manager crossed his arms. That's what they all say. Officers, you can check her bag. She's got more than $200 worth of items in there. Daniel didn't want to make a scene, but the crowd was already watching. A few shoppers whispered among themselves. He exchanged a look with Chris, who gave a small nod. Ma'am, Daniel said carefully, I'm going to need you to come with us to the station so we can sort this out properly. The woman sighed, not resisting. If that's what you need to do, she replied. They gently took her bag, confirmed the items inside, and placed her under arrest. Chris read her rights while Daniel secured the handcuffs. She didn't fight or raise her voice. She just stood, there quiet and composed as if she'd been through worse things in life. As they led her out of the store, Daniel couldn't help feeling uneasy. Something didn't feel right. He'd handled enough theft cases to know when someone was guilty. Most suspects panicked or made excuses, but this woman looked more disappointed than afraid. In the car, the silence was thick. Chris glanced at her through the rearview mirror. Ma'am, can I ask why you were so calm back there? Most people would be upset. She smiled faintly. I've learned that getting angry doesn't fix misunderstandings. Daniel turned slightly. You sound like someone who's dealt with this before. She didn't answer. She just looked out the window, watching the city pass by. At the station, the officers escorted her to the front desk. The clerk on duty looked up, surprised. What's this? Possible shoplifting, Daniel explained. We'll need to process her until we can confirm. The clerk nodded and began the paperwork. The woman sat quietly on a bench while they entered her information into the system. When Daniel asked for her ID, she handed it over without hesitation. He looked at the card and froze for a second. The name sounded oddly familiar. He couldn't place it, but it stirred something in his memory. He passed it to Chris. Chris's eyes widened slightly as he read it. Wait, this name, isn't she? He stopped mid-sentence, lowering his voice. Daniel leaned closer. Isn't she what? Chris hesitated. I think I've heard that name at headquarters. I'm not sure, but it sounds like someone high up. Daniel frowned, trying to recall. The woman noticed their unease and gave a small, knowing smile. Is there a problem, officers? Daniel quickly shook his head. No, ma'am. Just routine. But inside, his thoughts were spinning. Could this really be someone from the higher ranks? No, that didn't make sense. Why would a senior officer be at a supermarket, much less accused of shoplifting? Still, the thought made him nervous. After finishing the initial paperwork, Daniel went to confirm the ID details in the system. When the screen loaded, his stomach dropped. It was true. The woman they had just handcuffed and brought in was Deputy Chief Laura Henderson, one of the top officers in their department. She was known for her strict professionalism and fairness, and they had just arrested her. Daniel rushed out of the room and whispered to Chris, "It's her. She's the new deputy chief, I just confirmed it." Chris's face turned pale. "You've got to be kidding me. We arrested our superior officer?" Daniel nodded slowly. "We did." Both stood frozen, unsure of what to do next. Chris whispered, Do we uncuff her? Should we apologize?" Before Daniel could respond, the clerk at the desk muttered, "Guys, the captain wants to see you. Now." They followed the clerk to the captain's office, hearts pounding. The captain was already there, looking serious. Laura was sitting across from him, her hands resting calmly on her lap. Someone had already removed the handcuffs. "Officers," the captain said in a low tone, "care to explain why the deputy chief was brought into my station in cuffs for shoplifting?" Daniel tried to speak, but the words tangled in his throat. "Sir, we didn't know. The store manager called it in, said there was proof. We followed standard procedure." Laura looked at them with an unreadable expression. "They did what they thought was right," she said softly, "though I wish they'd looked closer before deciding." The captain sighed, rubbing his temples. "I'll handle this. You two wait outside." Daniel and Chris stepped out of the room, feeling like the floor had vanished beneath their feet. They sat in silence in the hallway, every minute stretching longer than the last. Chris finally whispered, "We're done, man. Our careers are over." Daniel shook his head, staring at the floor. Maybe not. She didn't seem angry, just disappointed. Half an hour later, the door opened, and Laura walked past them. She paused for a moment and looked at them both. "Next time," she said calmly, "make sure you have all the facts before you put someone in handcuffs." Then she walked away, her steps steady and quiet. Neither officer said a word for a long time. When they were finally called back in, the captain told them she had decided not to file any complaint. "Consider yourselves lucky," he said firmly. "You followed procedure, but this should teach you a lesson. Always confirm before you act." That night, Daniel couldn't sleep. He kept replaying the scene in his mind, the calmness in her eyes, the way she spoke, and the feeling of guilt that followed. He had treated her like any other suspect, but now he realized that being by the book didn't always mean being right. The next morning, he went back to the store to speak with the manager. "Did you ever finish checking the security footage?" he asked. The manager looked embarrassed. "Yes. Turns out the self-checkout machine froze mid-payment. The receipt printed later. She didn't steal anything." Daniel nodded slowly, feeling a mix of relief and shame. "Thank you for confirming." As he walked out of the store, he saw the same customers from the day before, laughing, shopping, living their normal lives. None of them knew what had happened behind the scenes, how a simple misunderstanding had almost destroyed someone's reputation. And for Daniel, that day marked a turning point. He realized that truth wasn't always obvious at first glance. Sometimes it hid beneath assumptions, waiting for someone patient enough to uncover it. The next few days at the station were filled with awkward silence. Everyone had heard whispers about what happened at the supermarket. No one spoke about it directly, but every time Daniel or Chris walked through the hallway, conversations seemed to stop mid-sentence. The younger officers avoided eye contact, and even the clerk at the front desk suddenly became overly polite. It was one of those moments in life where embarrassment doesn't fade easily. The air around them felt heavy, and both officers could sense the unspoken judgment. The mistake they had made was not small. Arresting a superior officer was something that could stain a career forever. Daniel tried to focus on paperwork, but his thoughts kept drifting back to the moment he saw her name on that ID card. He replayed it over and over, thinking about what he could have done differently. Chris, on the other hand, had become unusually quiet. Normally talkative and confident, he now spoke only when necessary. 3 days later, they were called into the captain's office again. Both walked in nervously, not sure what to expect. The captain looked calm, but his expression didn't give away much. He gestured for them to sit down. "She asked to see you," the captain said simply. Daniel blinked. "Who?" The captain raised an eyebrow. "The deputy chief, of course. She's at headquarters today and wants to meet with both of you this afternoon." Chris swallowed hard. "Sir, is this disciplinary?" The captain sighed. "You'll find out soon enough. Just remember, own your actions. She values honesty." By the time the clock hit 3, the two officers were standing outside the large glass doors of the central office. The place looked more formal than their small precinct. Polished floors, neatly dressed staff, and a calm that felt heavier than silence. When they were led into her office, Laura was already there, sitting behind her desk. The sunlight through the window made the room glow softly. She wasn't wearing her uniform. Instead, she had on a plain white shirt and dark blazer, looking composed but approachable. "Sit down," she said calmly. Both men obeyed instantly. For a moment, no one spoke. The quiet stretched long enough to make Daniel's palms sweat. Finally, Laura broke the silence. "You both know why you're here." "Yes, ma'am," Daniel said quickly. "I'm not here to humiliate you," she continued. "But I need to understand what went through your minds that day." Chris looked nervous but spoke first. "We got a call from the store manager. He said there was clear video evidence. We didn't want to risk letting someone go who might actually be stealing." "It all happened fast," Laura nodded slowly. "And did it ever cross your mind to question why a woman who wasn't trying to hide anything, who waited calmly near the door, might not be guilty?" Daniel hesitated. "It did, ma'am, but..." The manager seemed certain. "And people were watching. We didn't want to make it look like we were ignoring the report." Her eyes softened a little. "I understand. You were doing what you thought was your job." She leaned back in her chair. "But your job isn't just to act. It's to think before you act. You can follow every rule in the book and still make a mistake if you don't use judgment. That's what happened." Neither officer spoke. Her words hit harder than any punishment could. She continued, her tone gentler. "The machine at the store malfunctioned. I told the cashier, but before they even checked, security called you. You both handled it professionally, but what mattered most wasn't the arrest. It was what came after. How you reacted once you realized your mistake." Daniel nodded quietly. "We were shocked, ma'am. We didn't know who you were." "I know," she said with a faint smile. "That's actually what made me decide not to file a complaint. You didn't treat me differently. You treated me like anyone else, which means your actions weren't based on favoritism or fear. But still, there's a lesson here." She stood up and walked to the window, looking out over the city. "When I was your age," she said, "I once arrested the wrong person too. A man accused of stealing medicine. It turned out he couldn't afford it for his sick child. I followed the rules just like you did. But that day I realized the difference between enforcing the law and understanding people." Her voice softened further. "The law tells you what to do. Humanity tells you how to do it." Chris listened intently, his expression full of guilt. "We're sorry, ma'am. Truly, we should have looked deeper." She turned back toward them. "Sorry doesn't fix mistakes. Learning from them does. That's why I'm assigning both of you to a temporary program." Daniel looked puzzled. "Program?" She nodded. "You'll assist me in reviewing community policing practices, understanding how we deal with people, not just procedures. It's not a punishment. It's an opportunity to grow." The two exchanged surprised glances. They had expected suspension, not mentorship. "Thank you, ma'am," Daniel said sincerely. Laura smiled faintly. "You'll thank me later. For now, be at headquarters tomorrow morning, 8 sharp." As they left her office, Chris exhaled in relief. "That could have gone way worse," Daniel nodded. "Yeah, but I get the feeling this isn't going to be easy." The next morning, they showed up at headquarters, unsure of what to expect. Laura was already there, reviewing case files. She handed them each a stack of reports. cases where officers had made wrong assumptions during arrests. "I want you both to study these," she said. "Every mistake here started with a small decision that felt right in the moment." Over the next few weeks, Daniel and Chris worked under her supervision. She wasn't the kind of leader who raised her voice or gave long lectures. Instead, she guided through questions that made them think deeply about their instincts. Whenever they reviewed a case, she'd ask, "What did the officer miss?" Or, "What else could have explained the suspect's behavior?" At first, it was frustrating. They were used to solving cases quickly, not second-guessing every detail. But gradually, they began to understand the value of slowing down. One afternoon, they accompanied her to a neighborhood meeting where residents voiced their concerns about policing. Some people spoke harshly, criticizing officers for being too aggressive or judgmental. It was uncomfortable to hear, but Laura listened patiently to every word. After the meeting, Daniel asked her, "Doesn't it bother you when people talk to you like that?" She smiled. "It used to, but now I see it differently. People don't get angry at us because we wear uniforms. They get angry because they feel unseen. Our job is to listen, even when it's hard." Chris nodded slowly. "I guess we didn't do much listening that day at the store." Laura looked at him kindly. "You're listening now. That's what matters." Over time, their respect for her grew. She never once mentioned the supermarket incident again. Yet every lesson she taught seemed to tie back to it. She made them observe, think, and most importantly, understand that behind every case file, every suspect, there was a person with a story. One evening, after a long day of field work, the three of them sat outside the precinct. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. Chris broke the silence first. "You know, ma'am, I used to think being a good cop meant catching bad guys fast. Now I think it means something else." Laura smiled faintly. "What's that?" "It means not confusing speed with justice," he said quietly. She nodded approvingly. "That's a lesson most officers take years to learn. You learned it early, the hard way." Daniel leaned back, staring at the horizon. "I still think about that day. I wish we'd noticed the signs. You didn't panic, didn't argue. You tried to explain, but we didn't really listen." "That's part of growth," she replied. "We can't undo the past, but we can make sure it changes how we act in the future." There was a pause. The sound of distant traffic filled the silence. "Ma'am," Daniel said after a while, "if it had been someone else in your place that day, someone who wasn't understanding, we'd probably be out of a job right now." She chuckled softly. "Maybe, but I believe in giving people a chance to learn. Mistakes reveal character, and both of you showed remorse instead of pride." The wind picked up slightly and the day faded into twilight. For the first time since the incident, Daniel felt lighter. What had begun as the worst mistake of his career was slowly turning into something else, a turning point. He realized that respect wasn't something earned through badges or ranks. It came from humility, from learning to admit when you were wrong and being brave enough to grow from it. That night as he drove home, Daniel looked at the city lights reflecting off the streets and thought to himself that sometimes life has strange ways of teaching lessons. Some are gentle, others arrive wrapped in embarrassment and fear, but all of them shape who you become. And this mistake, was shaping him into something better. A few months had passed since that unforgettable day at the supermarket. What began as a humiliating misunderstanding had quietly turned into a deep learning experience for Daniel and Chris. Working directly under Laura had changed the way they saw their jobs. Before that, they had been like most young officers, eager to act fast, prove themselves, and follow the rulebook without question. But Laura had shown them something different. She taught them to pause, to observe, and to think before jumping to conclusions. Her lessons were never delivered like a lecture. Instead, they came through stories, experiences, and small moments that left lasting marks. One morning, the three of them met early for a community patrol. It wasn't a dangerous area, but it was known for small thefts, disputes, and misunderstandings. The kind of neighborhood where people's frustration showed easily. Laura insisted on walking instead of using the patrol car. "You see more when you're on foot," she said, adjusting her cap. As they walked down the street, a few shopkeepers waved at her. Daniel noticed how naturally she connected with people. Even those who didn't know her by name seemed to sense trust in her presence. She spoke to them with warmth, not authority. It was something Daniel admired deeply, the way she earned respect without demanding it. While they were chatting with a bakery owner, a commotion broke out near the corner. A young boy, probably around 13, was being held by a store clerk who shouted angrily. He tried to steal again. I caught him this time. People began to gather. The boy struggled, his face pale and scared. I didn't take anything, he cried. I just looked at it. Daniel and Chris moved quickly toward the crowd. The clerk pointed at the boy's backpack. Check his bag. He's always hanging around here, pretending to look at snacks. I saw him hide something. Laura arrived seconds later, her calm presence cutting through the tension. Let's all take a breath, she said gently. Sir, please let go of the boy. The clerk hesitated but obeyed. The boy's hands trembled as Laura knelt slightly to his level. What's your name? She asked softly. Tom, he mumbled. Okay, Tom, she said. Do you mind if we look in your bag? He hesitated, then nodded. Laura carefully opened it. Inside were a few notebooks, pencils, and one chocolate bar still sealed with the price tag on. The clerk crossed his arms. There, that's from my store. Laura looked at the boy. Did you take this without paying? Tears welled up in his eyes. I was going to pay later. I just wanted something sweet. My mom doesn't have money today, the crowd murmured. Some people looked sympathetic, others skeptical. Laura sighed softly and stood up. Sir, she said to the clerk, how much is it? $2, he said coldly. Laura pulled out her wallet and placed the money on the counter. Here, paid in full. Now no harm done, the clerk frowned. You can't just let him off like that. He needs to learn. She turned to him, her tone still calm but firmer. And he will. But not through humiliation. Sometimes what people need most isn't punishment, it's understanding. The boy looked down, ashamed. I'm sorry, he whispered. Laura handed him the chocolate bar. Next time, ask before you take. Most people will help if you're honest. Remember that. As the crowd dispersed, Daniel couldn't help but notice the parallel between that moment and what had happened months ago. Just like that boy, they too had been judged before anyone truly listened. Later, when they returned to the precinct, Daniel finally said what had been on his mind. You handled that differently than most would have, Laura smiled. Because I've seen what it feels like when people assume the worst. The boy didn't need to be dragged into the system for $2. What he needed was someone to remind him that one mistake doesn't define him. Chris leaned against the table. You really don't believe in harsh punishment, do you? She looked thoughtful. Punishment has its place, yes. But I believe more in correction than condemnation. Once you label someone too early, they start to believe that label. Her words stayed with them. Over time, Daniel began noticing small things he'd overlooked before. How people's eyes revealed fear long before their words did. How sometimes silence said more than explanations. He had started to see humanity not as weakness, but as a strength. A week later, something unexpected happened. Laura called them into her office again. There's something I want you both to help me with, she said. A store has reached out about a complaint. Same supermarket where it all started. Daniel froze for a second. The same one? She nodded. Yes. Apparently they've had another misunderstanding. A woman was accused of underpaying, but the situation sounds suspiciously similar to mine. I thought it might be fitting for us to handle it together. When they arrived, the store manager looked surprised to see them. He recognized Daniel instantly, though he tried to hide his discomfort. Officers, he said nervously. We've had an issue with a customer again. She sang the system overcharged her. We've been having trouble with the scanners lately. Laura looked around calmly. Let's take a look at the footage before we jump to conclusions, shall we? The manager hesitated, but this time he didn't argue. He played the full video on the monitor. It showed the customer scanning items, looking confused when the screen froze and waving for help. Laura turned to him. See the problem? The manager looked embarrassed. Yes. The machine glitched again, she nodded. Then you know what to do. Apologize, fix the system, and make sure this doesn't happen again. He nodded quickly, promising to take care of it. Outside the store, Daniel couldn't help but laugh softly. Full circle, he said. Laura smiled. Life has a funny way of bringing lessons back to you until you learn them properly. That evening, as they walked back to their car, she spoke again, almost to herself. That day at the supermarket could have gone differently. You could have treated me harshly. Or I could have used my position to ruin your careers. But instead we all chose to learn. That's the only reason we're standing here together now. Chris looked thoughtful. Do you ever regret not filing a complaint? She shook her head. No, because what would that have done? I'd have proven I had power, but I'd have lost faith in my team. You made a mistake, but you didn't hide it. That matters more than perfection. Her words stayed with them long after they went home. That night, Daniel sat in his small apartment, staring at the city lights through his window. He realized how much his view of the world had changed. Before, he had always thought being a police officer meant following orders, arresting suspects, and keeping the streets safe. But now he saw a different side, one that involved empathy, patience, and understanding human behavior. He remembered how terrified he'd been when he found out who she was, how small he had felt in that office waiting for judgment. Yet instead of punishment, he had found guidance. Instead of anger, forgiveness, and that forgiveness had changed everything. The next morning, Laura gathered the team for a short meeting. I've been thinking about what happened these past few months, she began. Mistakes are part of this job. But what defines us is how we grow afterward. I see two officers here who've done exactly that. Daniel and Chris exchanged a quick glance, unsure what to say. She continued, You both reminded me of something I almost forgot, that leadership isn't about being untouchable. It's about understanding what it's like to stand on both sides of a mistake. For a moment, the room was silent. Then she smiled. Now get back to work before I start sounding too sentimental. Everyone laughed quietly, but the warmth in the air was real. As the day went on, Daniel couldn't help but feel grateful. That one misunderstanding, which once felt like the worst moment of his career, had become the reason he learned what true justice meant. It wasn't about being right all the time. It was about being human enough to admit when you weren't, and brave enough to change because of it. And though the city outside stayed as unpredictable as ever, Daniel now walked through it with new eyes, slower, wiser, and kinder. Because sometimes the people you think you're helping are actually the ones who end up helping you grow. The city had just entered early winter. The days were shorter, the air colder, and the streets quieter. Daniel had started to enjoy walking to work instead of driving. It gave him time to think about the months that had passed, about the lessons he had learned, and about how much he had changed since that day at the supermarket. Every now and then, he still felt a wave of embarrassment when he thought about it. But then he remembered Laura's calm face, her words, her patience, and the way she had chosen to turn their mistake into an opportunity instead of punishment. It wasn't just forgiveness, it was leadership. Inside the station, things had changed too. Officers had begun to talk more openly about mistakes and communication. Laura had encouraged new workshops about empathy, fair judgment, and slow decision-making. She often said, "The best decisions come from calm minds, not rushed hands." One morning, as Daniel poured himself coffee, Chris walked in with a grin. "Guess what? We're going to be featured in the department's training seminar next week." Daniel raised his eyebrows. "Featured? For what? Our story?" Chris said with a half-smile. "Laura's using our supermarket case as an example. She says it's proof that growth is possible." Daniel groaned. "Great. Just what I wanted. To relive my most embarrassing day in front of 50 officers." Chris chuckled. "Hey, at least this time we're the lesson, not the problem." When the day of the seminar arrived, the large meeting room was filled with young recruits and senior officers. Laura stood at the front, confident but calm, like always. On the projector screen behind her were simple words. "Understanding before acting." She began, "A few months ago, 2 of our own officers made an honest mistake. They acted based on what they saw, not what they knew, and in doing so, they taught us something valuable, that truth often takes patience." Daniel and Chris sat quietly in the front row. Everyone knew who she was talking about, but Laura never mentioned their names. She focused on the lesson, not the event. She continued, "When I was wrongly accused of shoplifting, I realized how easily perception can outweigh facts. But I also realized that good officers are not the ones who never err. They're the ones who learn humility when they do." The room was silent. Everyone was listening. Daniel felt a quiet pride. What once was his biggest mistake had become something meaningful. After the seminar, Laura approached them. "You both handled that well," she said softly. Daniel smiled. "I was sweating the whole time." She laughed lightly. "That's a good sign. It means you care. Later that week, a new case landed on their desk, a situation that would test everything they had learned. A man had been accused of stealing from a local electronics store. The shop owner insisted there was clear footage, and the man was already in custody, waiting for questioning. Normally, Daniel would have followed routine procedure without hesitation. But this time, he wanted to look deeper. When they arrived, the man sat quietly in the interview room, staring at the table. He looked tired, not defiant, not scared, just exhausted. Daniel sat across from him. "Can you tell me what happened?" The man sighed. "I went in to buy a phone charger. I used the self-checkout. It scanned wrong, I think. I didn't notice until the security guard stopped me outside. Said I hadn't paid for it." Chris looked at the file. "The footage shows him walking out without paying," he said quietly to Daniel. Daniel nodded. "Yeah, but that sounds familiar, doesn't it?" Chris smiled faintly. "Very." They decided to visit the store themselves. When they asked the clerk to replay the footage, they noticed something strange. The scanner froze halfway, just like it had in Laura's case. The man had even waved to get the cashier's attention, but no one noticed. Daniel turned to the store owner. "Looks like a technical error. He didn't intend to steal anything." The owner frowned, embarrassed. I didn't realize." Daniel gave him a calm nod. "It happens. Just make sure your machines are checked regularly. These small mistakes can ruin someone's life." Back at the station, they released the man with an apology. He thanked them quietly, his eyes watery with relief. "Thank you," he said softly. "Most people wouldn't have listened." Daniel shook his hand. "Everyone deserves to be heard." As the man walked out, Laura appeared near the hallway. She had been watching from a distance. "You handled that perfectly," she said with a proud smile. Daniel smiled back. "I guess we finally learned the lesson." She nodded. "That's what real progress looks like, when you do the right thing without needing someone to tell you." Later that day, she invited them to grab coffee at a small cafe near the precinct. The three of them sat outside watching people hurry along the busy street. It was a cold afternoon, but the warm drinks and quiet laughter made it peaceful. Chris looked thoughtful. "You know, that man today reminded me a lot of you back then." Laura smiled. "The universe has a way of reminding us of our own lessons. Maybe that's how we stay grounded." Daniel leaned back. "I used to think being a police officer was just about following orders and catching wrongdoers. Now I see it's more about understanding why people do what they do." Laura nodded. "That's the kind of wisdom experience gives you. You can't learn it from books or training. You have to live it." The three of them sat in silence for a while, watching the city move around them. People crossing streets, talking on phones, rushing to their destinations, each with their own worries and stories. Daniel suddenly said, "It's strange. I feel like that one mistake at the supermarket did more for my career than all the years of training before it." Laura chuckled. "That's because mistakes, when faced honestly, are the best teachers." Chris grinned. "Still, I'd rather not repeat it." Laura laughed softly. "I think you've learned enough." Weeks turned into months, and the department began to notice the difference in how the two officers worked. They listened more, questioned fairly, and treated people with patience, and no matter how stressful the situation. One day, Daniel was assigned to train a new recruit. The young man was eager and full of energy, just like he had once been. During a patrol, the recruit spotted someone acting suspiciously near a store and immediately wanted to confront him. Daniel stopped him. "Wait, watch first. Don't assume," the recruit frowned. "But he looks like he's about to run." Daniel smiled. "Looks can be deceiving. Give it a minute." They watched as the man simply adjusted his jacket and walked away. The recruit looked confused. "So he wasn't doing anything wrong?" Daniel shook his head. "No, and if we'd stopped him, we might have made him feel guilty for nothing." The young officer nodded slowly. "I see what you mean." That small moment made Daniel realize just how far he had come. He wasn't just learning anymore. He was teaching others the same lessons Laura had taught him. One evening, as the sun set behind the tall buildings, Laura called him to her office. "I wanted to tell you something," she said, her voice warm. "You and Chris have grown more than I expected. You've turned a mistake into a foundation." "That's rare," Daniel smiled. "We had a good teacher." She paused for a moment, then said quietly, "You know, when I was standing in that store being accused, I felt humiliated. But now looking back, I realize it was meant to happen. It allowed all of us to see something important, that respect and understanding go both ways. Even leaders need reminders sometimes, Daniel nodded. It changed all of us, Laura looked at him kindly. That's how transformation works. It starts with one uncomfortable moment and grows into something you never expected. As Daniel left her office, he felt a deep sense of gratitude. What had begun as a story of humiliation had turned into one of trust, humility, and growth. That night, while walking home under the city lights, he smiled to himself. He no longer saw the world in black and white. Every person he passed, every tired face, every stranger lost in thought, reminded him that everyone carried their own version of truth, fear, and hope. And for the first time in his life, Daniel understood that true justice wasn't about catching the guilty. It was about protecting the innocent from being misunderstood. The city had grown colder, and winter had settled in fully. The streets were quiet in the early mornings, and the soft glow of streetlights reflected off the wet pavement. Daniel and Chris had been working under Laura's supervision for months now, and the lessons from the supermarket incident had become part of their daily work. They were no longer the same officers who had rushed to judgment. Their perspective had shifted, and people around them noticed the change. One morning, the three of them were called to a local community center. There had been a small fight between two neighbors over a parking spot. It was nothing serious, but tempers had flared, and someone had called the police to settle the dispute. When they arrived, Laura immediately took the lead. She approached the two men calmly, asking questions and listening carefully. Daniel and Chris watched as she guided the conversation, not by scolding or judging, but by letting each person explain their side. "Let's slow down," Laura said gently. "We're all neighbors here. Everyone wants the same thing, respect and understanding. Let's figure out how to get there." The men began to calm down. They explained their frustrations not with anger but with honesty. The discussion became more about solving the problem than blaming each other. By the time they left the center, the tension had dissolved. Both men shook hands and Laura smiled at Daniel and Chris. "This is what I mean," she said quietly. "Our job is about more than arrests or paperwork. It's about restoring balance, helping people see each other even in conflict." Daniel nodded. "I never realized how small interventions could make such a big difference." Laura looked at him thoughtfully. The smallest acts of understanding often have the largest impact. Weeks later, Daniel and Chris were assigned to assist Laura on a new community outreach project. They were visiting local schools, talking to students about responsibility, honesty, and decision-making. Daniel had always thought this was simple work, almost administrative. But now he understood the importance. In one of the schools, a student had been caught taking a classmate's phone. The teachers had already spoken to the student, but tensions were high. Laura took the student aside and asked him calmly to explain what had happened. "I didn't mean to take it," the student said nervously. "I just wanted to see it. I didn't know it would get me in trouble." Laura nodded. "Sometimes we make mistakes without understanding the consequences. What matters now is that you take responsibility and learn from it." Daniel watched quietly, realizing that what Laura was teaching here was exactly what she had taught them. Patience, observation, and understanding before judgment. The student nodded and promised to return the phone and apologize. As he left, Laura turned to Daniel and Chris. "You see," she said, "most problems can be solved without punishment. We only need to guide people toward the right path." Chris smiled. "I guess I'm starting to see that being a good officer isn't just about arrests or reports. It's about helping people even when they make mistakes." Laura nodded approvingly. "Exactly. And that's why you both have grown so much since that day at the supermarket. Mistakes are lessons if we choose to learn from them." One afternoon, Daniel and Chris were reviewing reports in their office when the phone rang. It was the same supermarket from months ago. "Hello?" Daniel answered. "This is the store manager," the voice said hesitantly. "I wanted to thank you. After our incident with you and the deputy chief, we've reviewed all our systems and procedures. We realized how easily mistakes could happen and we fixed them. I just wanted to let you know it's been a positive change for us." Daniel smiled. "Thank you for telling us. We're glad it worked out." After hanging up, Chris said, "It's strange. That mistake didn't just change us, it changed them too." Daniel nodded. "Yeah, and that's the point, isn't it? One moment of learning can ripple through so many lives." A few weeks later, Daniel and Chris were asked to attend a ceremony at the department headquarters. Laura had been recognized for her leadership and her innovative approach to community policing. They both sat in the front row, proud to be part of the team.